Iron shot. You're well lit. Exceedingly well lit.
Yeah, it looks good.
We got the ponytails and we're ready to rumble.
Yeah, man. We're matching ponytails.
Okay, buddy. So today is the 3rd, I think.
Yes.
The 3rd of February, 2021. We're continuing to try and knock off some podcasts. This is the last month that we're doing this project.
That's right.
And then we'll both move on to other things.
Yeah, but we're trying to bang out as many as we can.
Just to make sure that I have to edit as much as possible. So today I thought part of the point of doing these is, of course, to discuss political ideas and
right.
political beliefs. That was one of the things we established all the way back at the very first episode. So today I thought we would talk about political activism. So what is political activism to you, buddy?
Oh, man, absolutely. So I always kind of think of political activists being centered around people who are very politically involved, but not politicians. They make their career advocating for people who they believe are not represented properly by politics, who do not get a voice in politics, and basically are kind of like unofficial representations for marginalized groups of people. That's sort of I think of it as.
Cool. So I think you kind of answered it in your description, but why are political activists not politicians?
One is that they are not formally elected. These are folks who basically just kind of form out of the communities they're involved in, and often they don't get into politics because they want to have a political career. They often get into politics because they are sort of pushed into it as the way, as they believe the best method of getting involved and getting changes in accordance with what they believe for their communities.
So I think let's abbreviate political activists to just activists.
Sure,
if
yeah.
That's okay.
Yeah.
And I think this is a really interesting division you've set up right off the bat. So, activists versus politicians. The way you've been sort of describing it so far makes it seem like there is these sort of two groups and that they are working perhaps not alongside each other.
But that's not necessarily fair all the time,
yeah.
Because oftentimes there are a lot of ways that politicians and activists align, and a lot of activists have political allies, and a lot of politicians come out of activist movements as well.
Do you think there's an issue that people would find if activists became politicians?
Well, fascinatingly, I was just talking to Josephine about this. So Josephine is a political activist that both of us have met and know. And she told me...
Worked with in prior podcasts.
Worked with her in prior podcasts. Hopefully we'll work with her again on subsequent podcasts. But one of the things she told me that was fascinating, and I don't know how universal this experience is, but she found that when she was pushed into sort of more of the political sphere, going towards the UN, things like this, and she found that the same groups of people that pushed her into the political sphere turned their back on her more often than not when she got there. She became sort of a persona non grata to a lot of people because she was one of them. She was one of them. She was the man. She was part of the system, and she could no longer be trusted. So I think
break up that relationship a little bit more. So,
yeah.
Are these activists who are pushing her, or are these politicians who are pushing her?
These are activists who are pushing her.
Right.
And community members pushing her as well.
And then sort of in those more clearer terms.
So then those same community members and activists turn their back on her or wouldn't work with her because when she gained some political clout.
Because she was now inside the system.
Inside the system, exactly.
So how do you feel about this sort of... Because, again, I think you're battling yourself a bit with this division.
Yeah. I honestly think the division, is there, and I think it's real. I don't think it's completely fair. kind of grown up, and I don't know if you've grown up with this, kind of dualistic understanding where some people say, oh, you got to work within the system in order to change things. You've got to, if you are interested in politics, you got to become a politician or politically active in some way. That has clout. And then other people say, well, we have to tear down the system. The system is corrupt. It's broken. We got to start something new. And I frankly it's taken me a while, but I frankly sort of don't agree with either of those in the extreme. Mm-hmm. I sort of see it as a hybrid. Like, I really think it's important to work within the system and to elect leaders that are going to actually make changes in that system. But I also think grassroots organizing and organizing amongst community members and not waiting for the slow bureaucratic mechanisms that we have in society is also really important.
Right.
But I don't think they're mutually exclusive.
Totally. So do you, the way you're setting it up, it sounds like activism for you is sort of a radical, an aspect of radical politics. Would that be fair to say?
I would say so, yeah. I think that's fair.
And obviously, so I guess, how then do you expand your idea of activism to include people who are clearly not as radical, but also aren't politicians?
No, absolutely. I think one of the big things for me is, it's getting people involved and getting people to do things is a very sort of slow process for a lot of organizations. And it doesn't even have to be something that radical, but there has to be a sustained effort of communicating why this matters to people who would otherwise not think it matters. Mm-hmm. I think, for example, of Floyd, who's another activist, and all he wants to do is podcast favorite. That's right. Hopefully for subsequent podcasts, he was number 2, I believe.
Yes,
he did. Yeah. But he's not doing anything that's too radical in my books. His group is going and picking up trash in the ravine system. But it is sort of fringe.
He does it in a pretty radical way.
He does it in a pretty radical way, exactly. But I don't think the act in and of itself people would see as particularly threatening. But the way he does it, in organizing large events, he's gotten the ire of the city. And the city doesn't, is trying to kind of clamp down on it or trying to limit how much access he has, which is, unfortunate in my opinion. But he said it took a really long... He's done it for over 30 years. And now he has, 50 to 100 people show up at his most popular events. And he only had 5 back when he started. So I think that's a success there. But it took a very, very long time for him to build a base of people who really thought this mattered. And that this was something that they felt like they should do.
So how does this juxtapose with your previous idea about radical politics supposedly being quick and bureaucratic politics supposedly being slow?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I think it's fair to say there are some things even outside of bureaucracy that just take a long time, and partly that's because the tools the tools necessarily aren't there, or the infrastructure isn't there to mobilize a bunch of people at once. So one of the big things about that is...
Do you really feel that, though? Because it seems like we have a lot of tools to mobilize people these days.
I guess now there are more tools, but I'm thinking back in particular when Floyd started out.
That's very true.
Back in the 80s.
When he was calling people.
He was just calling people and talking to people in the neighborhood.
Handed out flyers,
exactly. Now he says, it's much easier to communicate with large amounts of people. So I think one of the ways is that these organizations that kind of had to start out at a particular time and build up and then now can use tools, it's a different game that they're entering in.
Totally.
Yeah. But to go back to your kind of point, I think bureaucracy can be really helpful. I mean, bureaucracy, if you get sort of resources shifting towards what you want to do, say, when a liberal government comes in and suddenly there's funding available for stuff that you want to do versus a conservative government that, you've had to deal with for the last however many years, that can be like a watershed moment and you can suddenly get a lot of resources available. It's quick. It's night and day. But you still have to put up with the previous, however many years.
10 years whatever, yeah.
Exactly. And things really slow down and shut down or even backtrack on certain things. So maybe it's fair to say, just like all things, if you make sort of large sweeping statements about them, you always find exceptions to those rules. And I think that's true for my previous statements in this. But I do kind of, and maybe it's personal sort of bias, but I do think there is a bit of a grinding nature to working with government. But I don't necessarily see that as a bad thing. I do understand why activists who see these needs in their communities get frustrated by that, though.
Totally.
But I think one of the good things about sort of our democratic systems in North America in particular is they're built on checks and balances.
Yep.
And it's hard to change a bunch of things very, very quickly.
If they have to be checked at every stage.
Exactly. And that's honestly a really good thing.
Mm-hmm.
It's not perfect, and it sucks when you really have to ram stuff through that you want to do. But it also is really important when someone like Trump gets elected, and unlike, say...
Yeah, we're going to be jumping around a lot, I imagine, between Canadian and
exactly.
American politics.
Canadian-American politics. And, Trump has 4 years to get his agenda done. He can change a bunch of things and put forward a bunch of things, but he can't fundamentally alter the structure.
Without a real political cohesive will.
Exactly.
So I think this idea to me of the speed of different mechanisms in political action is really interesting to me, and there's obviously there's so much depth to all this stuff. It's one of the reasons I think we're both endlessly fascinated by it.
Yeah, definitely.
But this idea that your governments, your politicians are slow, and then your activists are fast.
Right.
I think is just kind of a misnomer. It's people observing these different actions at different times. And sort of trying to draw conclusions about this overall very complicated structure.
Right.
So, there's, I think. So this is my idea. I'm going to bounce this off.
Yeah.
I think a lot of it comes from the fact that one of your most basic ways of interacting with politicians is by casting votes. Mm-hmm. And this seems like a slow process because of just the way election cycles work. Right. And then one of your basic ways of being an activist is to go out and physically do something, to go and clean up the dawn, to go and actively, recruit people for a particular cause, or to hold a fundraiser, or whatever it happens to be. So you have this sort of very tangible response to activism in a way that often I feel like maybe you don't when you cast a vote for a politician.
Right.
And then maybe they don't win.
Yeah.
So do you think, what do you think about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think a lot of people are stuck with this idea, and it's very unfortunate that their only say in their government comes along every 4 or 5 years, depending on what country you are in here, right? And that they get to vote, and that's it.
Yeah.
I remember talking to several people, including Josephine, about this, and her saying, progressive politicians in our districts, in our wards, they really want people to come into their office. All of the people that they get in their office are big lobbyists who can afford to send people, and especially if the candidates in question are NDP or even progressive liberal people, they want to listen to other voices, but people don't show up, except rarely, right? And what they're trying to the message from that is that they're really excited to talk to people who do show up and want to engage with them and want to work with them, because they feel like they're doing their job then and actually representing their constituents.
Of course.
But there is this I think there's a prejudice people have to getting involved in politics because they don't think it will make a difference.
So what is that, the whole prejudice? Why do you think people have that impression?
I think as well, I think.
So sorry, the prejudice is that. Restate that for me.
Yeah, so I think part of the prejudice is that. Maybe it's more complicated than just not making a difference. I think that's part of it, though. I think people get disillusioned by government, and the fact that they don't see it necessarily working for them. I think also part of the prejudice is people, I think, shortchange themselves. I think they think politics is very complicated. And, how do I go as an ordinary citizen and get involved with this? I don't know what to say. I don't know what to do. And that's something I've definitely kind of faced within myself. Like, why don't I go knock on all these doors? Like, I don't, what do I have to say? Why does my voice matter? And stuff like that. So.
Do you have any methods that you use to sort of help people disentangle complicated political thought?
Yeah, well, I think one of the big things is just kind of, as you talk to different, and it depends, like you talk to different people. I think going through and finding sort of threads that people can agree on, like human rights is one of the big ones.
Mm-hmm.
Because there's so many complicated, especially now with the online culture being so polarized at this particular moment. Human rights is something I really draw on. If I can get people who are like, people should have water and people should be allowed to eat, people should have basic kind of standards of living.
Most people can agree on those
things.
Most
people can agree on those things, and that there is a value on a human life,
Totally.
Whether you're conservative or not, and a lot of people resonate with that. So I think that helps a lot if you can kind of bring it back to a language of human rights. I also think, I really, because of where I come from and the tradition of the left-wing tradition that we both share and come from, there's a tendency I think we have in that to dismiss people. And maybe, I don't know if this is fair, but I've definitely noticed it in a lot of people, sort of I was growing up around, especially in school, to dismiss people who don't have the right opinion. To just kind of, shut the door on them and be like, oh, get them out of my life because they don't agree with Black Lives Matter or they don't agree with that. And
we can touch on this later, but there's kind of this division between theory and practice.
Exactly.
That's very, very prominent in left-wing politics.
Exactly, yeah. And for me, that's really unfortunate because I think the places where you can intervene in someone's life politically is talk to them about things.
Yeah, engage,
mm-hmm. Exactly. And especially like if you're someone who's is not necessarily on the front lines of a particular issue,
mm-hmm.
You're in a place where you're maybe not as emotionally charged about this, and so maybe you can engage with people who disagree with this issue versus somebody who really can't or is not in the space to do that, you mm-hmm. know? So that's another thing about allyship, I think, that we sometimes forget.
Totally.
But anyway, yeah, that's kind of how I begin to sort of help people, including myself, disentangle these really complex political ideas.
So I have kind of a funny one as well.
Yeah.
That in many ways sort of strikes a really odd balance between my actual political beliefs
right.
and the way you get there in the real world.
Right.
And that is be selfish.
Mm.
When so many times when people are engaging with politics, they're doing it in this like really arcane like theoretical framework,
right.
where they're like pulling from this different stuff that they've seen
right.
on Facebook, or more generously that their family has introduced them to in
right.
sort of a hodgepodge of ways.
Right.
And there are so many instances where you can just ignore all of that stuff, all
right.
of your background, and be like, how does this affect me?
Right.
How does this matter to me?
Right.
How does this change my daily life?
Right.
And I remember really vividly, I've probably told you this story before, but talking to my roommates, I was living in a totally different place,
right.
totally different people, living with two fairly conservative roommates, and one of them was talking about how the increase in the minimum wage was going to crash the Ontario's economy.
Oh, yeah.
And I had all sorts of really good arguments for why that was total bullshit.
Right.
But I also had one little piece of knowledge that he worked for minimum wage.
Right.
And I was like, buddy, they're raising your wage.
Right, exactly.
And that is something that like hits people in a very different way.
Yeah.
When they all of a sudden it's like, hey, wait a minute, I'm acting against my own self-interest
yes.
here. And the self-interest of everybody else like me.
Right.
Everybody else who makes minimum wage.
Yeah.
That's a really easy little jump.
Yeah, exactly.
All of a sudden you're not worrying about the entire economy.
No, exactly.
Just worried about bringing in that paycheck.
About you, yeah, exactly.
So I mean I think your human rights idea fits very closely into that.
Yeah, definitely. If you can bring it down, I think that's good. Did he end up changing his tune at all? Do you remember?
He was he was one of those guys who I think deliberately had these very sort of touch and go ideas.
Oh, I see.
So in many ways he was very pro human rights, but
right.
he was also kind of and clearly backed by a conservative tradition.
Right.
I think his parents were both quite conservative.
Right.
And a number of his friends were too. So,
Right.
real political ideas all over the place. We
Yeah,
have these
fair.
I do my best to have these little conversations and just kind of like nudge things into a more human direction.
Right.
But also, I think, how do you think? I think now is probably a good moment to move on to the theory. Like, how do you think this interaction between theory and practice? What is that doing to the dialogue in politics in Canada and the U.S.?
I think it's really tough. I think, one of the things is when I went to school, there was a lot of stuff. I went to a really progressive school after high school. That was even more progressive than the high school we went to. And you get a kind of download.
A legendary college.
Yes,
Oberlin.
Oberlin, yeah. And it was a really good place, but you get a kind of download, a discourse download, when you go to something like that. Mm-hmm. Suddenly, because it's very left, very progressive, you get a download of like, okay, this is what everyone is thinking about at once. So that's when we got into intersectionality. A big touch point on the left for the last at least 10 years, probably more.
Yeah, something like that.
But, in the mainstream in the left for the last, years and years, if not a decade, at least to my understanding, the idea of trans rights and LGBTQ rights and gender fluidity was another big one that came to the forefront, and that was also really important. Black Lives Matter emerged. Racial justice really took a center stage in a way I don't think it had before. And now kind of this moment where we're in with indigeneity and land back. These are sort of big sweeping moments in leftist discourse, and there's all this theory backing it up, right?
Right. So this is the theory side of things.
This is the theory side of things, exactly. And I think the theory side of things is incredibly important. Where it was difficult was that we weren't ever taught this explicitly, but it was almost implicit that in order to participate in the struggle for justice, you had to get all the theory right. You had to kind of have a little checklist that, okay, I'm using the right language at all times. I'm doing this work. And the problem is when, I went out after graduating college and I had all this great knowledge and, it was really cool and I was thinking about all these things differently. I went to New York City and I engaged in ecosystem restorations, and everyone I was working with had not gone to, almost everyone had not gone to not gone to Oberlin. Yeah, not gone to Oberlin. And, you're forced to deal with people who say things and do things that, based on this new discourse would be considered really wrong and at times heinous, but yet they're all working towards this goal of trying to help ecosystems together. And you have to figure out how to work with these people. And the fact that you love them, you care about them as human beings, but they say stuff that's, you find really problematic, but which is just real life, Yeah. But I think part of my sort of understanding was, one of the skills I had to learn was how, important the discourse is for informing the context, but the discourse should not be a prerequisite for participation, and it just isn't, And I think a lot of people, especially when they engage online versus in real life, they can assume that the discourse is a way to sort of filter out who I should and shouldn't work with, who's using the right language, who's doing this. This is the people I want to associate with,
Right.
And
because online is kind of, at a basic level, a place where the theory and discussion of theory is just so much more prominent and prevalent
exactly
than any sort of practice.
Exactly. And I think people, it's a problem for me when people form their relationships based on the theoretical discourse alone. I think it's important that you're able to have discussions about theory with people, and that you're able to use theory to a certain extent to determine, okay, do I really want to do theory? Theory is really helpful because theory, I think, helps people articulate values.
Totally.
And I think there's something to be said for the fact that, if you want to enter into a relationship, whatever kind of relationship that is with somebody, you want to make sure that a certain amount of your values align with their values, and talking about theory is a really easy way to...
In a way, it's just planning for success.
Exactly, it's just planning for success. But I think people take that too far, and they assume that, theory is almost like gospel, and if somebody doesn't line up or meet a certain theoretical standard, then they need to kind of be pushed out, or there has to be degrees of separation between them and you. Anyway, I went on for a bit, but what do you think about all this?
Yeah, I mean, I'm interested to see sort of what your position is. I think I'll definitely weigh in, but I'm curious about how. So you covered theory really well. Tell me more about practice.
Yeah. I mean, practice is really interesting. And okay, just as long as I don't feel like monologuing, you weigh in when you.
Sorry, I can jump in.
Whenever you want. I just want to make sure.
I'm perfectly capable of interrupting.
Okay, good.
Time,
so you come in when you have something that's good. When you have something to say, for sure. Buddy. But yeah, practice. I mean, practice is fascinating. Practice, especially if you go, because it's cool. You go from the theory. And the theory tells you, say, let's take an example. The theory tells you that if you want to help a community, you should, and this is leftist theory, you should involve yourself with the community. You should come as an ally and not assume that you have all the right answers, and that you enter into this community and you listen and learn. Now that's great advice. But when you enter into a community,
they don't give a fuck.
They don't care. No, exactly. And you have people with crazy opinions and very different opinions than you have, and you have to still work with them, and that's great. So I think from practice, a lot of it is about finding who I want to work with, finding who I want to work with. And I also think a lot of young progressive people are faced with this choice when they come out of school, for example, and they want to get involved. And there's several different paths they can take. They can take, and I think a lot of them end up taking one of two paths. And the first path is to go on the grassroots level.
This is people who have the similar sort of background to you.
Yeah, exactly.
They're rooted in left-wing politics.
Politics.
They come out of school and they're like, I got to do real-world stuff now. I got two paths.
Exactly, two paths. And I think a lot of them either go into two types of organizations. They go into really well-resourced either government jobs, business jobs,
civil service,
or nonprofits. That's the big path. And these are types of the organizations that have resources, they have money, they do things a certain way, and they're good. They're stable.
Got it.
The other path is they join organizations that are grassroots, that are trying to figure things out, that are community-based, that are smaller scale in nature. They don't have as many resources as the larger ones. And they're doing really good work, but aren't necessarily as stable.
Right. So you go, on one hand, these large-scale nonprofits and just government agencies.
Exactly.
And on the other hand, you have grassroots
organizations. And I think there's pros and cons to both. I think, one of the pros of the smaller groups is that it's, you don't have to go through any kind of bureaucracy in the same way. You can get as close to the issue as matters. And usually if you're working with activists, they really care about the issue that you're involved in. So if you want to go and get involved with food security in St. Jamestown and you join the St. Jamestown Co-op, you're doing stuff around food security. Yeah. And you don't have to go through all these hoops and jumps to do that.
You're not funding people who are funding people who might be doing some food security stuff.
Definitely. One of the cons of that is you're the first and last line of defense in that organization. So, many things can go wrong. There's not the stability. You're not going to get paid as much. Or
at all.
Or at all. One day. No, I'm just joking. But just a little bit of humor. But you still have to, so you have to take the brunt of being in an unstable community-run organization that has requires you to whatever. If you care about that organization, you're going to end up volunteering a lot of your time for that organization. Totally. I really generally believe that.
And live by it.
And live by it, exactly. And you got so that's something to consider. Pros and cons of that organization. I think some of the pros of being in a really stable organization is that, say like an Evergreen, for example, or a large nonprofit, is that, that's a job. You're going to get paid. You're not going to be expected to volunteer your time in the same way that you will in a community organization. They're often structured 9 to 5, but you're not going to be necessarily doing exactly what you want to be doing because it's a large organization and they have to fundraise, they have bureaucracy, they have a way of doing things. So,
and if somebody shifts at the top and their vision doesn't align with yours,
exactly,
then you still have to do
what you have to do. Exactly.
Things.
So a lot of, I think, really idealistic students go into those organizations and they kind of get hit with the reality of it, you know, and like, because I've talked to
on both sides,
exactly. And I talked to, and this is of course just my own sort of analysis on this. I'm not claiming it's gospel or anything, but I have kind of kept my ear to the ground about this stuff and just talked to a bunch of other people about it.
Of course.
And you know, students get burned out in both, and young people get burned out in both. And I think that's part of the difficulty is, you know, this is, you know, I don't know the kind of solution to that, or that's just part of the process. Maybe there can be more mentorship and just kind of be like, come actually do stuff and try this out before you graduate. See if this is your type of thing, you know? This is like not easy to do, you know? And another, you know, one more thing I will have to add is, a lot of students, I think, a lot of young and idealistic people generally, they want to really change things. They want to change things for the better. And organizations that are within communities, you know, are not necessarily uninterested in that or unfocused by that, but often they're just trying to keep everybody afloat.
Yeah.
And
trying to keep their heads above water.
And so, you know, if you don't want to do that kind of work, whether that's working like in a food bank style and just giving food to people and stuff like that, that's a lot of what the community level does, you know. You know, just maybe look towards a sort of larger systemic organization, even if it's more distance, because if you want to actually work in the community and change things, you're going to spend changing people's lives. Can sometimes just mean giving them a basket of food once a week, you know, helping them stay afloat. And I personally have no problem with that. I think that's great to do, but I am under no illusions that that's fixing food insecurity systematically issues, exactly. So anyway,
so I think you've already touched on it a little bit, but one of the things that really stands out to me is how we've been talking about kind of practice on the one hand, and theory on the other hand. And as with most things, there's just clear overlap. And these places where theory and practice kind of blend together. And I think one of the real struggles that people face, especially when they come at things from the theory side of stuff, is theory is just in general something that applies in the aether to all things. You know, that's kind of the way it's taught, and actually boiling it down to individual specifics and to individual people and individual interactions is very difficult unless it's done on sort of a comparison of theory. So, you know, we're in a discussion, I have my theory, you have your theory, we chat it out, and then this is the process you were talking about earlier where you're like, you know, do our ideals align? But practice is actually what you can do physically in order to try and get things done. In order to change politics, in order to, on some level, enact theory. So this overlap between theory and practice is very interesting to me, because I think one of the major struggles that people have is that people really struggle to take their practices and figure out how they affect everybody. You know, to take these small things that they do and figure out how they fit into these larger issues. And to me, that seems to be something that is missing from the puzzle for these people. I don't know if that's something you have.
No, I think that's a really good point, and I think it's, you know, people struggle. It's like a you know, a thoroughfare. You know, people struggle to get from the practices to the theory, and from the theory to the practices, and they get clogged up in there. Absolutely. And you know, that's why I think something that, you know, is really key is about training. Like one of the things that keeps coming up in the work I do around human rights and involved in all the many personalities, and that is like, we've got to do democracy trainings. We've got to do trainings that actually help young people get involved in political discourse. And this is why it's fascinating to talk to kind of intergenerational folks who are of an older generation, who've been around the block a little bit, because they talk about times when it was easier to get involved in the government.
Why do you think that is?
Well, what they said is that basically you as a citizen there was fewer kind of sort of impediments placed upon your path to get involved. And I don't know the details of this, but one, for example, was that you could just show up to a meeting downtown and you could attend and go in and say for question period or things like that. You could actually easily just kind of show up and be put on the schedule to come and speak. It's apparently very difficult now.
Yeah.
Yeah. Another thing, was that there was less of a sort of perceived distrust of government, especially in Canada, in the 1970s and 80s before, and in Ontario in particular, before we had more conservative leadership. This is just a general sort of analysis that Josephine and a couple others gave to me. And so, it was easier to go and talk to your civil servant. And moreover, then it wasn't completely unheard of to do that sort of thing.
Totally.
So not only did you feel more comfortable doing it, but other people around you, felt more comfortable doing it too. There was a bit of a culture around engaging in politics that wasn't there before.
How much of that do you think is down to just changing, like the changing demographics, the changing size of the country?
I think that's a big part of it for sure. And I think as well, like there's a lot, I think it's changing politics, changing demographics, and people, from different parts of the world coming here. And, one of the things about St. Jamestown is that, people don't always speak English. They speak a bunch of different languages, and they have to learn English. So that's another barrier to engaging in politics. If you don't speak English or French, like how are you supposed to engage with your politicians who
speak English and French?
Exactly.
Or more English than French.
More English than French, exactly. Here at least. So that's another part of it. And I also think as well, there's a lot of different streams, and I'm by no means an expert, but just to sort of gloss over generally, I do think after 9/11 in particular, institutions of government just upped their security, and it became less...
Sure, there was a legitimate concern that giving people really open access to
your political institutions could be bad. And I totally get that, but I think one of the offshoots of that is it's harder to sort of gain access to some of the the physical governmental buildings that talking to people who were active in the 80s and earlier, it was, they could just walk into these places and they could just cross the border and they could just do the X, Y, and Z.
Yeah, no, you used to be able, before 9/11, you could just go across the border without a passport.
Exactly.
This is the American border.
This is the American border.
It's a big one.
Yeah, definitely. Exactly.
One of the biggest borders in the world.
Exactly. And so there was sort of like it was just easier to gain access to certain spaces as well. But I definitely think changing demographics, the changing political landscape, another thing, of course, was the download in Ontario, the downloading of from the federal government to the province of basically, how should I put this? Oh yeah, just requirements, responsibilities. Right? Yeah. Exactly. Thank you. Yeah, and then the province downloading that to the cities. So that's another big thing. So then system gets overloaded and people are just trying to function. There's less time and less resources put towards, say, maybe engaging people or having time to engage people.
This gets a little deeper into sort of the nuance of Canadian politics.
Exactly.
And I remember the way it was described to me many, many years ago.
Yeah.
For some reason it stuck out, is that in the U.S., the states sort of have an open sheet of what they can do,
right?
And then the federal government has a very clear list of rights, responsibilities, and powers,
right?
And then in Canada, it's the exact opposite way around. The federal government has the open sheet of what they can do, and then the individual provinces have a very explicit list of their rights, responsibilities, and powers.
Exactly.
And that is something that on a macro, on a theoretical level, I find fascinating. And over my life, I've sort of flip-flopped on which is the right way to break things up.
Yeah.
And a lot of it, of course, depends on the politics in the actual country and how the people up top are actually making the decisions.
Exactly.
And, the different sort of political pieces that you have involved.
Right.
But in Canada, when we've had sort of especially, there was a big block of conservatism, and in general, Canada's a really weird place because it is pretty conservative for what seems to be a pretty liberal nation.
No, exactly.
But when you have this power for the federal government to essentially figure out what the sheet is for the lower provinces, that puts them in a position where they can say all of these things are your responsibility, but we're only going to give you half as much money as you need to do them.
Right, totally.
And that's just sort of a troublesome flaw in how that setup exists.
Right.
The federal government has this particular relationship with the provinces, and then the provinces, of course, to a certain extent, regardless of who's in power, there's definitely a desire to try and shift effort, to shift control of things over down the level again.
Right.
Because, Toronto's a giant city.
Yeah.
Ontario in general is not that prosperous.
No, exactly.
But Toronto's pretty darn prosperous.
Yeah,
It makes a lot of money.
Huge, yeah.
So that I think is just a fascinating relationship between each of these different levels.
Absolutely.
The municipal, the provincial, Canada, and the federal level.
No, absolutely, and that's a good point.
So no, what do you? Let's. We're. Hello, Marps. We're getting to the end of our allotted time here.
Yeah.
So I guess what's to wrap up, kind of, we've touched on policy, we've touched on theory, we've touched on the intersection between them.
Right.
What do you see as the way forwards for these groups? Is there a solution to these issues? Is there a way for people to get better at practice and in a way that touches into theory more? I guess the question is, what do you feel like is more the push? If you had to choose a side that has to fix its stuff better, are you going to push more towards the policy, the theory people doing a better job of bringing their theory down into reality? Or are you going to push more on the side of the practice people doing a better job at incorporating theory into their practice?
It's a really good question. I honestly think I would put my emphasis on working with the practice people. And I think for me that's because I've just noticed in my life, that if I'm pushed in the right circumstances, I can actually do things and get more politically engaged. So recently I wrote a deputation, and I presented it to the city council, and I had never done that before.
Good job, buddy.
Thank you, man. And it wasn't that hard to do. It was really easy, but I did it because I cared enough about this issue and wanted to try and get politically engaged, and it was just something I hadn't done before. And it's like, okay, I've got that under my belt. And just, it's fascinating realizing how the city works, and just that you get to do this, and maybe it doesn't have an impact, or maybe it does, but
you did
it, and I think it's just getting, one of the things, and I think once again they're both, if I have to pick a side, that's the side I pick. I think they're both important, but I think just helping people, even holding their hand as they do these things, just as my hand was held, and be like, it's good to engage in your political process. You don't have to do it alone, This is something that you can do and get better at doing. It's a skill, right? I think that's really important. And I think once people engage more and more and have the help of somebody who's done it before them, help them along and do it and show up with them, then they can develop the confidence to teach other people too. But that's just my ideas around it. Yeah.
First, thank you, buddy. No, so it's funny because I think this is obviously a massive simplification.
Right.
But I would say that you're sort of the more practice guy.
Yeah.
And I'm sort of the more theory guy.
Right.
And you think that practice can do a bit more, and I think that theory can do a bit more.
Right, yeah.
I think that there's a lot of really fascinating stuff that's gone into theory, and a lot of really, just like progressive, not in terms of left-wing politics, but just in terms of the way people are thinking about the world, progressive thought that's been done, but that way too little has been done in terms of just figuring out the sort of middle chunks, like we got an idea of sort of how people on an individual level should interact with the world, but figuring out how those people come together into organizations, figuring out how those organizations interact with the organizations that already exist.
Totally.
I feel like there's a lot of work that needs to be done there.
Totally. So that's where you can see yourself intervening.
Well, that would be something that would be great if I could figure out a bit more about.
Yeah, exactly.
But anyway, thank you so much for talking about this,
man.
buddy. The final question, as always, what do you want to see in Canadian American politics going forwards?
Absolutely.
5, 10, 15, so whatever.
Something I would really like to see is I'm wondering if I would really like to work with somebody on a campaign in the next 5 years.
Nice. So you want to dip your toe into that political sphere
exactly.
a bit more.
And I don't think I've maybe not run for office myself necessarily, although that'd be kind of cool. But
why not?
Yeah, exactly. But maybe that I'll try and run for office in 5 years. But if not, at least to work with somebody who is running for office, and then work with them if they get elected.
It's definitely good to do that and then run.
Exactly.
Get some experience.
Get some experience. So that's for me the next 5 years. I'd love to see that. How about you, man?
That's great. Man. I want to figure out better how I can be politically involved in me sort of ways. So, because in the sort of things that I'm good at, often I feel like don't have as much of a place in these grassroots organizations, and then I'm really allergic to sort of bureaucracy as well. So when you go back to those two big paths, I don't feel like I'm a very good fit for either of them. Right. And maybe I'm just being an asshole and hedging so that I don't have to do anything. No. But I would like to figure out where sort of my place is and where I can use my skills to try and advance the political ideas that I think about and value.
Totally. Maybe those middle chunks, those places in the middle.
Yeah,
right?
We got to make them and then we got to do them.
Yeah, maybe that's where somewhere between the bureaucracy and the grassroots, somewhere between the theory and the practice.
Make something there.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, buddy. Thank you so much.
Thanks, man. That's a good one. That's a really good one.
We'll hit the button over here.
Yeah. Nice.